everyone, and welcome back to Historiansplaining. A historian tells you why everything you know is wrong. And these lectures are on SoundCloud, YouTube, Spotify, and other platforms. And if you can help to keep these lectures coming, and if you want to hear the patron-only lectures like Virginia Part 1, please go to my Patreon page. The link is in the description. So this lecture will be Virginia Part 2, A Dominion on Fire, 1646 to 1685, and it is brought to you by the Great Lakes Midwest. So this lecture will deal with how Virginia grew to become the biggest, most valuable, most lucrative colony in all of North America, but at the same time, the deep divisions and the growing contradictions within this colonial society sparked a massive conflagration, both literally and figuratively, that destroyed the colony's capital and threatened to destroy the entire English colonial project, but also paved the way for a new kind of colony and ultimately a slave society. So this lecture naturally follows up on my previous lecture, Virginia Part 1, The Successful Failure, which I posted on Patreon. And in that one, we covered the native Powhatan Confederacy that formed before the European arrival, and that was one of the strongest, most centralized states in indigenous North America. The creation of Jamestown and its survival through starvation and other disasters, the larger-than-life figures of John Smith and Pocahontas and the things that they came to symbolize, the massive tobacco boom and the system of indentured labor that fed workers into this booming tobacco industry, the efforts of the governor, William Berkeley, to shore up the Church of England, to open up the colony's trade to more markets, and to diversify the colony's agriculture into materials like grain and wine, potash, and silk weaving. And we left off with the final defeat of the Powhatan Confederacy, leading to the treaty in which the Powhatans became vassals, paying tribute to the English. So at this point in the mid-1640s, it would seem, with the English in complete control of the entire Tidewater region of what we now call Virginia, it would seem that the door would be open for the governor, William Berkeley, to refocus again on his projects of diversifying the colonial economy and advocating for free trade. But in fact, the rest of this term in office would end up being consumed by the tumult of the English Civil War. So how did this civil war across the sea in the mother country affect Virginia, and how did they respond to it? Well, as for the governor, Berkeley, his response was initially opportunistic, at least as far as trade policy. So Berkeley led the colony in taking advantage of the chaos of the Civil War. After 1642, with the English king and parliament taking up arms against each other, they really did not have the time or the resources to monitor or control who landed in the Chesapeake, and most of all, they could not stop their main rivals for sea power in the North Atlantic, which was the Dutch. So Virginia took advantage by selling as much as they could to the Dutch merchants without fear of penalties, and the Dutch customarily paid much higher prices for tobacco than the English did because they had almost no sources of their own. And as of the end of 1648, so once the Civil War has been dragging on for several years, reportedly, in the Chesapeake, there were merchant ships buying tobacco, namely 12 from England, 7 from the New England colonies, and another 12 from the Netherlands. And this allowed the sellers in Virginia to actually play off these different buyers against each other and look for the highest possible prices. And Berkeley basically allowed this free-for-all and even justified it on the grounds that the parliamentarian government that was seizing control in England was illegitimate anyway and could not enforce laws against selling to foreign merchants. And this stance may have been initially just purely opportunistic, but soon it became clear that Berkeley would be forced to take a stand on the actual core conflict between Crown and Parliament in England. And as we've seen, in addition to being a passionate booster of the colony of Virginia, Berkeley was also a conservative in most matters, especially in religion. And not surprisingly, when push came to shove, he sided firmly with the Crown. So in 1649, when news came to Virginia of the trial and execution of Charles I, the Governor Berkeley immediately proclaimed the king's son, the Prince of Wales, also named Charles, as Charles II. So he did not allow any sort of interregnum, any break in the continuity of royal authority. But that was just the governor. What about among the populace of the colony? Well, it seems opinions were somewhat divided. Most were royalist, but there were some who sympathized with Parliament as well. And remember, even at this late date, there were still some Puritans in Southern Virginia. There also were laborers and freedmen drawn from all different regions of Britain and mainly from the lower classes. And there were signals that some of these colonists sympathized more with Parliament and the new Commonwealth regime. So Berkeley, after proclaiming the young Charles as King Charles II, he then followed that up with a further proclamation that anyone who openly approved of the execution of Charles I or denied the right of his son Charles II to the throne would be held as guilty of treason. And this made Virginia one of only 2 colonies in the English Empire to officially side with the crown during the interregnum, the other one being Barbados, which was the wealthiest and most established English colony in the West Indies. So possibly this, stance taken by Virginia and Barbados, it may have related to the fact that each of these colonies was a bit older and was more traditionalist with strong planter elites. At least you could say a fairly strong planter elite was forming by this time in both of these colonies. In August 1650, Parliament was firmly in control in England, and they placed an embargo on Virginia and Barbados in punishment and demanded that they surrender their royal charters. But they didn't initially have any way to enforce this. In the fall of 1651, the Royalist Party in England suffered their final defeat at the Battle of Worcester, where they were led unsuccessfully by the young Prince Charles himself. And after that point, the English Commonwealth government dispatched a fleet across the ocean, which forced Barbados to submit to parliamentary authority. They then dispatched another fleet of 15 ships to Virginia to blockade the colony and, if necessary, to attack and force their surrender. Now, most of these ships were lost at sea on the journey, but in January 1652, 4 surviving ships did finally reach the Chesapeake and sail up the James River, approaching Jamestown. The Governor Berkeley at first called up a militia of about 1,200 men to defend the colony, and there was a long standoff, with Jamestown being blockaded for about 2 months. But finally, the governor and council saw that they could not win. They couldn't hold out indefinitely. So they disbanded the militia and met with delegates from the English fleet and negotiated terms of surrender. Berkeley agreed that he would be removed from office and replaced by 3 commissioners appointed by the Parliament, 2 of whom were actually colonists from Virginia. But still, Berkeley and everyone in his regime would receive amnesty, and they would be able to live peaceably as private subjects, and Berkeley himself retired to his estate called Green Spring. And all the land grants and boundaries in the colony would remain in place. There was no massive leveling, right, like people were afraid was going to happen in England. Also, the colony would finally have a greater degree of freedom of trade, and the churches would continue to use the Book of Common Prayer for at least 1 more year. They would have this reprieve where they could continue the traditional Anglican worship. So all in all, the Commonwealth was very lenient on Virginia, probably because they wanted to quickly get past this conflict and integrate Virginia into the new regime. But some colonists still took it as a sort of point of pride that they had been the last royalist stronghold to fall and submit to the new regime. And some colonists came to call their colony the King's Dominion or the Old Dominion as a kind of tongue-in-cheek salute to their loyalty to the crown, even though they were by far the newest dominion under the English crown, right? They had existed for less than half a century, but they took on this sort of pretension of a sort of old, loyal domain of the crown. Now, much like in England, very important changes would come in the Commonwealth period through the rest of the 1650s, and these would then have a dramatic and lasting effect, continuing in the years afterward. So for Virginia, possibly the most significant of these was the rise of chattel slavery. So as we've talked about previously, the first African captives to be landed in Virginia came in 1619. But the population continued to be extremely small through the 1620s and 30s. In the 1640s, it started to rise somewhat. By 1649, it was about 300 people, so that's still a tiny fraction of the population of the colony, but it was twice what it had been just 9 years earlier in 1640. And it continued to grow further through the 1650s, through the rest of the Commonwealth period. Now, why did this happen? It seems this was mainly due to an increase in supply and availability. So through the 1620s and 30s, the slave trade on the Atlantic was entirely in the hands of the Portuguese and the Dutch. And the English had really given up on their involvement in the slave trade after the disastrous failures of John Hawkins back in the 1560s. So the planters in Virginia could only obtain slaves from foreign merchants, and the supply was expensive, sporadic, unreliable, and technically illegal, since, according to English law, they were not supposed to be trading with Dutch privateers or merchants at all. And it would also be totally disrupted in times of war. All of this was then thrown into doubt and confusion with the English Civil War. It was unclear now which laws and treaties were still in force, and even if they were, who had the ability to enforce them. And so English merchants now were feeling more emboldened to enter into trades and traffics that had previously been off limits, including very significantly the slave trade. And a big incentive that drew more English merchants into the Atlantic slave trade was the growth and success of Barbados, which was a very successful, prosperous English colony in the southeastern corner of the Lesser Antilles, on the sort of farther windward edge of the Caribbean islands. And hence Barbados was especially close to West Africa, and it was more feasible to land slaves there more cheaply and reliably, and it had a huge demand for slaves with the booming sugar plantations. So this then encouraged more English merchants to start undertaking slaving voyages, including triangular voyages from England to West Africa to the Caribbean and back to England. And then, as this developed, Virginia provided a possible sort of recourse, a secondary fallback market where cargoes of captives could go if there was some problem in Barbados, like warfare, rebellion, hurricanes, etc. And so, by the end of the 1650s, African laborers became a really visible presence in the colony, if still only a tiny fraction, about 1% of the total population. And the question lingered, of course, of what was their legal and social status. This remained ambiguous and was only addressed in a halting and piecemeal way. So early on in the 1630s, most of these African laborers still tended to be called servants, not slaves. And they usually seemed to be subject to more or less the same laws and rules that were applied to European servants. But this starts to change in the 1640s. And significantly, in the year 1640, a case was recorded that may have set a new precedent, certainly marks a new threshold in the historical record. So in 1640, 3 servants ran away from their master named Hugh Gwynn, and they fled northward to Maryland. One of these was Scottish, one Dutch, and one African, and he was called John Punch. And they were eventually caught by Gwynn and brought back to his plantation. And Gwynn wanted them to be punished. Ideally, as planters tended to want, he wanted them to be penalized by having their terms of indenture extended so he could get more labor out of them. And this was taken to the governor's council, and the governor's council made a judgment that all 3 of them would be punished by whipping, as was common. Each of the 2 European servants would have his term of service extended by 1 year. And John Punch, the African servant, would have his term extended for life. He now was basically, he and his labor were the possession of Hugh Gwyn for the rest of his life. So this is the first known recorded case in Virginia where a laborer was forced to work for a master for life. And this was distinct from the other two servants who had done the same thing. This extraordinary treatment almost surely relates to John Punch's ethnicity. So perhaps the counselors believed they could more easily impose this penalty on John Punch without the risk of inciting resistance or rebellion among the other servants who were overwhelmingly European. And this can be seen as a sort of strategy of divide and conquer, right? Manage resistance by creating tiers of status among the underclass. But still, it's significant that in this very early landmark case, lifetime enslavement was imposed as a punishment for a crime or a breach of contract. This would change later in the 1650s. So in the mid-1650s, another case arose, this one in the county court in Northampton County on the Eastern Shore. And in this one, a free black man named Anthony Johnson, he owned a large plantation of 250 acres, which was among the biggest in the colony, and that land was being worked by several indentured servants. One of them was an African-born servant named John Casor, but after some years of service, Casor left Johnson's plantation and went to work for another employer named Robert Parker. And in 1653, Casor filed a freedom suit in the county court, asserting that he had come to Virginia with an indenture contract, which assigned him to work as a servant for 7 or 8 years. And he had fulfilled this term and so was now free to work and live where he chose. But Anthony Johnson denied this, and he countersued, arguing that Casor never had any indenture contract, and so he was therefore bound to work for Johnson for life. And the court ruled in Johnson's favor. So this set a remarkable precedent, basically that if an African laborer cannot produce a contract of indenture, then he or she is assumed by default to be a slave and to be bound to labor for life. And this then dramatically lowered the status and standing of African servants in the colony. It was now assumed, without, proof to the contrary, it was assumed that they were outside of the stream of indentured servants working towards their eventual freedom. And so it makes sense that these so-called Negroes suddenly became much more valuable to planters because they could be exploited indefinitely. And so slave importation into the colony continued through the later 1650s, but they were still a fairly small portion of the population, and they were massively swamped by the much larger migration coming in from Europe, mainly from England, and the beginning of a population boom in the colony. So there was a demographic boom in Virginia, which it seems started in the 1640s and then really took off through the 1650s. And this boom came from a combination of two factors. The first just being continuing large-scale immigration. And this included criminals who, as we said, could be transported to the colony as a punishment for petty crimes or as a substitute for punishment. Also, a continuing sporadic importation of political prisoners. Some of these were Irish, deported from Ireland by the parliamentarian regime during the Civil War in the mid to late 1650s. There continued to be some freemen and yeomen from Britain who could pay their own way. Some of these were skilled workers. Others were smallholders in England who sold their land to pay for their passage to America. These often came with family, and they could then get grants of land in colony as a reward for immigrating. But still, the biggest source was voluntary recruits who accepted contracts of indenture. And these continued to arrive steadily in the number of about 1,500 to 2,000 per year. They were the large bulk of the migrants to the colony, maybe about 3/4 in total. And the practices of indenture and transportation in some ways began to improve. So ships now were usually timed to arrive in the colony in the autumn so that the new servants would have the winter time to adjust to the new environment and become seasoned in the vocabulary of the time. And this was somewhat easier since the, mosquito-borne diseases were much less intense and they would not be immediately hit by the deadly environment of the summer. They also were given better clothing and shelter. And by the late 1640s, much more servants were surviving past their first year. And then later, by the 1650s, more of them were living past the full period of 5 years and completing their terms of indenture. So the second reason for this demographic boom was that mortality dropped. So through the 1650s, people of all classes and statuses began living longer. Why did this happen? Well, this wasn't immediately clear at the time, but it seems in retrospect that colonists were learning how to deal better with the environment. They were siting plantations in more healthful locations, avoiding marshes and stagnant water that bred mosquito-borne diseases. The historian Edmund Morgan has also pointed out that more colonists began to plant fruit orchards, and this could provide a diet with more vitamins and nutrients, thus preventing scurvy and better supporting the immune system. It also allowed for the brewing of cider, which is more sterile and less likely than groundwater to be contaminated with bacteria like those that cause typhus. They also started to learn and adopt indigenous medicine, such as the use of so-called Peruvian bark, which contains quinine, to prevent malaria. So overall death rates dropped significantly, and this was also compounded then with more births in the colony, as more female migrants began to live long enough to become free, marry, and in many cases have children. So combined with the continuing immigration, this had very dramatic effects. So for one thing, just in sheer numbers, the population, it seems, grew almost threefold, from about 15,000 people in 1649 to 40,000 by 1662. The colony expanded geographically, especially northward into the northern neck between the Rappahannock and the Potomac. And the colonial population here grew from just fringe outposts with about 1,000 people in the 1640s to over 6,000 with many large plantations by 1660. The colony also boomed in many ways economically. So this population growth led to great growth in productivity with the greater availability of labor, which, as we said, was always the main limiting factor for Virginia. But this did not necessarily mean broad prosperity, because overproduction of tobacco, especially for a limited closed market, would lead to dropping prices. And this would become a big problem after the end of the Commonwealth and during the restoration of the monarchy, as we'll see later. Also, it led to great effects politically. So this population growth gave rise to new classes that had hardly been seen before in the colony, including impoverished smallholders, who were in more and more tightened circumstances as the price of their tobacco went down. Also, landless laborers and drifters. So as you have so many people completing their terms of indenture and becoming free, it becomes more and more difficult for them to obtain tracts of land, which had previously been so easy, as they were almost given away for free, as large land grants were split up and sold off cheaply in small parcels. This really ends after about 1650, and you now have more and more free people entering the labor market who cannot obtain land so easily, nor can they make as good an income through wages as wages go down. So this growing class would become politically explosive in ways that became clear after 1660, when the Commonwealth regime ended and Governor Berkeley was restored to office. So in January 1660, the Commonwealth-appointed governor of Virginia died, and the office was briefly vacant. By March of that same year, it was clear, even to people in the colonies, that the Commonwealth regime in England was coming to an end, and that Parliament was imminently going to restore the monarchy. And so the Virginia Assembly convened and simply reappointed William Berkeley to resume his office of the governorship. This led to some political stability, So Berkeley again served for a long time. He was the only really committed governor of Virginia in this century. And so he remained in office for another 17 years. And for about the first 8 or 9 years of this governorship, his regime was reasonably secure. And in this period, in the so-called Restoration period in the 1660s, a fairly cohesive governing class formed around Berkeley, which included large planters, judges, and government officials, many of them being Berkeley's own relatives or business partners. And early on, Berkeley and the other major planters expected that the colony would reap the rewards of their loyalty to the crown back in the 1640s. And this is when they sort of openly took on this moniker of the Old Dominion, sort of boasting of the loyalty that they had shown, unlike most other colonies. And it seemed early on that there was a real chance that they could get the policies that they most opposed undone, most of all the strict navigation acts. So very early on in 1661, Berkeley traveled to England, and he found audiences, pulled strings, and he campaigned for repeal of the navigation acts that restricted the colony's trade. And in 1663, he published a pamphlet called A Discourse in View of Virginia, in which he argued for the loosening of trade restrictions and the diversification of the Virginia economy so that they could get away from total reliance on tobacco and the English market. So it was sort of a two-pronged message, right? One to the court in Westminster and one to his fellow colonists. And on one level, Berkeley's pamphlet reflected this moment of optimism and ambition at the beginning of the Restoration period, but it ended up in disappointment. So the Navigation Acts were not repealed. Right? The Crown was still insistent on making sure that the benefits of this colonial project went only into English channels. And in fact, they were enforced with renewed vigor, including the rule that goods from the colonies could only be transported in English vessels. Now, as for this whole idea of diversifying Virginia and getting away from this complete monomania of tobacco, the Crown initially gave some support to this project and encouraged the planting of other crops and the pursuit of other products like flax and silk that could possibly build up a cloth industry in the colony. But the planters in Virginia, for their part, were not very interested. And with time, the Crown realized that these efforts to move to other crops would diminish the huge tax revenues that they were getting from tobacco. And so after a while, they turned against this whole endeavor, and it was quietly quashed in 1669. And basically, from that point forward, Berkeley gave up on this whole dream. Now, still, really the most important trend in the colony through the Restoration era was the continuing population growth, which again resulted from a combination of continued immigration and better life expectancy. And at this point, the immigration into the colony was starting to shift in terms of its sources and makeup. So for one thing, there was a traffic in African slaves. And this slave trade to the North American colonies was increasingly regularized. So in 1660, right with the restoration of the monarchy, the Crown chartered the Company of Royal Adventurers Trading to Africa, which would get some degree of Crown patronage in return for regulation. But there were a lot of problems, and this company really was not able to defend its traffic. So in 1672, it was dissolved and replaced with the Royal African Company, which was more armed and militarized and had more direct crown protection. So within the colony in the 1660s, a few families began to purchase large shipments of captives, and some of them accumulated workforces of several dozen slaves, up to about 80, it seems, on the biggest plantations. By 1670, there were about 2,000 African slaves in the colony, or about 5% of the entire population. So it's really become a significant presence. African laborers were increasingly viewed and treated as different from mere indentured servants. The term slave was used more and more often, and their legal status was further defined as below that of the indentured workers. For instance, in 1662, the House of Burgesses passed a pioneering law codifying the principle of partus sequitur ventrum, which means the womb follows the stomach, And what that means in code is the status of a child when born depends on that of the mother. So any enslaved woman, any of her children to which she might give birth, they are automatically enslaved. And conversely, a free woman who gives birth to children, those children are free. So this clarified the ambiguity of the status of children. It codified in law that a child could be a slave right from birth. And it gave an advantage to male slaveholders, many of whom knew that they were exploiting their enslaved workers sexually, and they were fathering children with them. And this law allowed them to quash any notion that these children that they were siring should be free. Furthermore, in 1669, another law was enacted holding that a slave master was not legally liable if a slave died from a punishment that they inflicted, like flogging. And this was necessary because the most common punishment for indentured servants was an extension on their term of service. So if they ran away or rebelled, you would make them work for another 2 years, 3 years. Well, this would not work with slaves because they were already held to be bound to service for life. So you couldn't extend their term of service any longer than that. And in this sense, slaves had nothing to lose. There was no reason not to resist or sabotage or run away. And so in order to be able to keep control of an enslaved workforce, the masters had to be able to threaten them with the harshest, most painful punishments. And flogging can lead to blood loss, infections, and it can lead to death. And ideally, a slave master wouldn't want that to happen. They'd want to keep their enslaved laborer alive, but they had to be able to threaten them with the worst physical punishments possible just to keep control over them. So with the increased availability and with these favorable laws, slavery became more and more prevalent and visible through the 1660s and 70s. In addition, there were more waves of political prisoners in the aftermath of the Civil War and interregnum. And in the 1660s, this included some English Commonwealth men who refused to accept the restoration of the monarchy and so were sent in bondage to Virginia. And it seems in 1663, a group of field workers who had been Commonwealth men were charged with conspiring to lead a rebellion and overthrow the government of the colony. There also were later influxes, such as in 1678, the last remnants of the Scottish Covenanters, and in 1685, English prisoners from Monmouth's rebellion against James II. But still, once again, the main source was voluntary indentured servants, who still were coming in at a rate of about 1,500 a year, so only slightly diminished from where it had been in the peak back in the 1630s and 40s. As of 1671, the Governor Berkeley estimated that the servant population in Virginia had reached about 6,000, and they were surviving their terms of service more often. He estimated about 80% of all indentured servants now lived out their term of indenture. And so the plantations had become a kind of demographic pipeline, with a large number being liberated each year and then being replaced by a similar number of new recruits shipped in to replenish the planters' labor supply. So the servants themselves, they did not see a big change in their legal or economic situation. They still labored away for years under strict control with practically no rights until they hopefully became free. And the number of servants in the colony more or less leveled off. So the segment of society that actually grew rapidly was the ex-servants, the freedmen and freedwomen. By the mid-1670s, they began to outnumber the indentured servants who were still under terms of contract. And these freedmen were looking for available land, or at least, failing that, profitable work, which they had been led to expect would come to them when their indentures ended. So what were the effects of this rapid growth in the population of freedmen? Well, this change would have reverberating effects, and it was a kind of double-edged sword, which led to a growing divergence, as some classes benefited from the effects and others suffered. And the divergence, after not too long, led to discontent and class conflict, and this would combine with the harsh economic conditions of the Restoration period to lead eventually to an open civil war. So the initial effects were that over the course of the 1650s and 60s, with the growing population and the expansion of the colony, especially westward and northward, small farms multiplied. In the 1660s, it seems the average size of a farm holding was only between 100 and 200 acres, and many of them were fewer than 100 acres. The main product, of course, was still tobacco, and the production of tobacco grew as these small farms proliferated. Then by the late 1660s, the available land was running low and becoming much more expensive. Fewer and fewer newly freed men were able to acquire any farmland at all, and these then had to work for wages or find some other way to survive. And in the Restoration period, the free population of Virginia, you could say, split into three distinct groups. Right? The elite of large landowners and officials, often closely connected to the governor. The class of small landholders, most of whom were ex-servants or freedmen. And the growing class of those who remained landless and worked for wages or lived by their wits. So how did the changing conditions affect these different classes? Well, let's just consider each one. Firstly, as for the small landholders, these are the ones who had between about 50 and 150 acres. So they had enough to grow some food and some tobacco. Some of them had families, but due to the sex imbalance, many of them were single men. And these generally obtained just as much land as they could work with their own manpower, and perhaps the labor of a horse or a mule or two. So through the 1640s and 50s, this setup had been enough to make a decent income and live fairly comfortably as a yeoman. But in the Restoration period, tobacco cultivation became increasingly unprofitable. Because more land was coming under cultivation and more tobacco was being produced, even as the markets in which they could sell were still severely restricted by the Navigation Acts. So they could only sell legally into the English market. This market was often glutted, and hence the price that the colonists were able to get for their tobacco kept declining. And there was also great volatility in these prices. In some years, the price was so low that it was not profitable enough to even ship out, and it sat on hand in the colony, basically going stale in warehouses and barns. But even in the better years, the proceeds from tobacco sales could barely exceed the cost of running a tobacco farm and feeding and clothing a household there. This crisis was then further compounded by the effects of two wars with the Netherlands in 1665 to 67 and again in 1672 to 74. And in each of these wars, the Dutch, with their superior navy, were able to block the English merchant fleet from reaching the colony, thus cutting the planters off from selling their crop, and they were able sometimes to sail into the Chesapeake and bombard plantations and trading posts along the shores. So the English government failed to secure the colony or its trade, and they also levied high taxes, even in peacetime, which was then further compounded by wartime levies to pay for the building of fortresses to be sited at strategic points on the coast, like Point Comfort. But just to add insult to injury, these fortresses were really impossible to build or maintain on the low, marshy shoreline, and they were completely ineffective and seen as basically just boondoggles. So by 1670, the small planters were tightly squeezed between falling tobacco prices and high taxes and expenses, and they were increasingly falling into debt. So they could not effectively pay for imported materials like cloth and shoes. And so while they might be able just to feed themselves based on their land, they could not clothe themselves. What had been a prosperous yeoman class was turning into one of paupers, described as living in penury, without decent clothes or blankets, and increasingly discontent. In 1667, the secretary of the colony wrote that the small income that a farmer could make from tobacco, quote, is very little to a poor man who hath perhaps a wife and children to clothe and other necessities to buy. Truly so much too little that I can attribute it to nothing but the great mercy of God that keeps them from mutiny and confusion, end quote. So already by the late 1660s, the elites in the colony saw the danger of a possible mutiny or rebellion. But this would not happen for several more years. Other factors still had to come into play, which involve relations with the other classes of society, including the elite. So let's consider next the colonial elite. This was made up of big planters and government officials of various sorts. So firstly, the large landowners, what I'll call basically those who had over 150 acres of land. These also struggled with overproduction of tobacco and falling prices, but they could absorb these shocks better. So they could store up large stocks of tobacco when the price was too low and wait for better conditions. With their larger estates, they also could benefit from economies of scale, from hired labor, which was very flexible, could be hired and fired at will, and which was increasingly available and cheap. With this growing class of landless freedmen, prevailing wages went down. So for all of these reasons, the big planters could weather this depression in tobacco during the 1660s. Also, they were able to obtain favorable laws from the assembly and favorable rulings from the courts, which were largely run by their own friends and relatives. And these included the laws favoring the powers of slaveholders, just for one example. In fact, one could say that this class began to take on the character of an entrenched upper class, which really hadn't existed in the colony before. So these were able to ride out the ups and downs in the tobacco trade and even prosper to some degree. But this prosperity, too, was a sort of double-edged sword. It allowed them to translate their growing economic power into a social prestige, including by taking on the trappings of gentility, much like the English country gentry. So wealthy families in this Restoration period started to cultivate prestige through intermarriage among people of their own class, through service, like service on the vestries of the parish churches, patronage of the church, elegant ceremonialism, as in weddings and baptisms, and also in their lifestyle. So some kept skilled craftsmen as servants on their estates, like weavers, tanners, and shoemakers, and these now could supply them with craft goods rather than buying imports from England. And some had so-called Negro servants, especially as domestic slaves within their households. And the marks of gentility were seen maybe the most dramatically in architecture, which of course is the art form that survives the most prominently in Virginia. So fashionable architecture could be seen in grand estate houses and their outbuildings, and in churches, chapels, and courthouses. There was increasing building in brick, as well as timber and sod, which had been the original materials. And brick was easy to make with the red clay that was widespread in Virginia. So as for houses, possibly the first finished brick house in the colony was built in 1640 by Thomas Allen at Broad Bay Manor near Cape Henry at the mouth of the Chesapeake in what's today Virginia Beach. Brick houses then proliferated and grew more grand in the Restoration era. So probably the first really grand Restoration-style house in the colony was the Arthur Allen House, built in 1665 in Surrey County, south of Jamestown. And more specifically, you could say it's in the Carolian style, the sort of simplified English Baroque style that was much the fashion in the reigns of Charles I and Charles II. The Arthur Allen House, which also later came to be called Bacon's Castle because it was pulled into Bacon's Rebellion, but it is a simplified Baroque mansion with high gables and a projecting enclosed front entranceway. It also had formal English gardens and rows of complex decorative brick chimneys. And this style of chimneys, very much characteristic of English Baroque, was mimicked in another brick house called Winona, built in the 1680s in Northampton County on the Eastern Shore. And the basic layout of the Arthur Allen House is also seen again in the house called Foster's Castle, which was built around the same time in New Kent County, which is on the York River north of Jamestown. And this wave of grand house building was followed soon after by churches. So in 1669, St. Mary's Whitechapel was rebuilt as an elegant rectangular church of painted timber and whitewashed plaster in Lancaster County in the Northern Neck, north of the Rappahannock. So you can see this as kind of a coming to the fore, a coming of age of the new planter elite in the Northern Neck. In 1680, a grand brick church tower was added to the main church in Jamestown, and in the mid-1680s, St. Luke's Church was built in Isle of Wight County down the James River southeast of Jamestown. And this one was built in a striking, complex, eclectic, and manneristic style, based more or less on a simple Jacobean room church, but embellished with Gothic details, including a unique large Gothic east window framed with brick modillions. So really unlike anything you would see in England. And these sorts of churches also began to acquire elegant communion silver like chalices, and many other ordinary parish churches and chapels were beautified with brickwork, woodwork, plasterwork, and glazing, which became more and more available in the colony. So you see really a sort of flowering of a self-possessed, self-assertive elite that wants to see itself as a kind of reflection of the English country gentry. But at the same time, as the historian Edmund Morgan, I keep citing him over and over, but his book, American Slavery, American Freedom, is possibly the great classic of American colonial history. And as Morgan has argued, the Virginia elite put so much effort into their displays of gentility, partly out of anxiety. They perceived that the small landholding class was increasingly resentful of them. They saw the gentry as corrupt and nepotistic, exploiting colonial offices and tax monies for the benefit of their exclusive cliques. And the governor's counselors and judges often were closely related by blood or marriage. And the governor himself was increasingly involving himself in local county government and the court system, which he packed with his cronies. And many of these also held multiple offices, like surveyor, clerk, or sheriff at once. And so knowing that the ruling class had fairly little popular support and was increasingly resented as a sort of parasitic class by the smallholders, the governor Berkeley held no elections for 14 years after 1662. He knew that there would be too much change and upheaval if all of these smallholders were allowed to vote. They would probably toss the bums out, as you would say today. Now, all in all, the elite perceived that their position atop the social structure was precarious, since although they liked to take on the trappings of the English country gentry, they really had very few instruments of real social control, like the upper classes had in Britain. So in Virginia, this gentry had no army or navy to command. They had an understaffed church with few clergymen and no actual titles of nobility. And so the elite had to try to maintain their position with soft power and to try to build up and project prestige through these displays of status. Nonetheless, there were increasing instances of smallholders confronting or insulting their supposed betters, such as by asserting in court that they were just as good as the judges or commissioners who were presiding over these courts, or through small acts of defiance, like taking a pew in the church that had been reserved for the high sheriff. And these are real cases that show up in the court records because these men were often fined or even arrested and put on trial for these sort of offenses against the elite. So one can see that the class chasm between the large and small planters was widening and that class tension was intensifying. But still, this did not lead to any mass action. The smallholders were widely dispersed and mostly isolated on their rural holdings. They had few chances to come together, and so small acts of defiance never really amounted to any serious challenge to the social order. For that line to be crossed, two more elements were necessary. The first one is the third class of free colonists, which we've mentioned, the one that was growing the fastest, and that was the landless freedmen. So let's talk about this class. It was increasingly difficult and expensive for freedmen to obtain land, and the obvious fallback, if one could not do so, was to work for hire on an estate or in a workshop. But as the size of this workforce mushroomed, the prevailing wages dropped. So it was increasingly impossible to get by as a wage worker, at the same time that it was impossible to stay above water as a small planter. So thousands of these people, not surprisingly, emigrated, including to the northern colonies and increasingly after 1670 to Carolina, which was a new booming colony just to the south. Many others took to a life of wandering or vagabondage. They occasionally might take up paid work, but they would alternate this with hunting, banditry, and poaching of livestock, especially of swine, which wandered often in the woods and which they could slaughter and cook for great feasts in the forests. So these landless freedmen ranged all over the colony, but they were especially clustered in the northwest, in the borderland counties of Westmoreland and Stafford along the Potomac. And like the smallholders, they too mainly had to resort to wearing rags, and they took on an increasingly wild appearance. And they tended to despise the landed gentry, perhaps even more than the smallholders. So small bands of freedmen would often infiltrate plantations and incite the indentured servants to abandon and run away with them on the roads or into the forests. They would rarely ever gather openly, except on election days, where hundreds might come out of the woodwork at the polling places and cast their votes in any way that they believed would upset the ruling class. Hence, in 1670, the governor and assembly banned non-landholders from voting. And this then cut off the possibility for a political resolution to these growing class tensions. And this might, of course, only encourage an eventual resort to violence. Now, in this context, we have to know Virginia was a highly armed society. So with the population widely dispersed, one could not expect help from miles away if one was threatened by, bandits or by a Native American attack or other threats. And even if these individuals out on their remote farms and farmsteads, even if they did want to get help from neighbors, they would have to shoot off a gun to signal for help. So for these reasons, nearly all men in the colony carried firearms to defend themselves, and women largely did too, to defend themselves in their homesteads, if they had them, against animals, bandits, or foreign or indigenous attackers. And landholders were expected to serve in the militia. So guns and shooting were such an ingrained part of everyday life that it became fashionable to fire off some shots just at parties and drunken social gatherings, to the point that the assembly had to ban the firing of guns at gatherings and celebrations, except for weddings, where all parties, it seemed, agreed that it was simply a necessary part of the festivities. So there was an exception for that. Now, as for the landless freedmen that we've been talking about, they were armed as well, and hence they presented an even further sense of threat when they appeared at polling places, and hence the growing sense of menace that these uncontrollable, restive, defiant vagabonds presented to the colonial order. The saving grace, you could say, was that they rarely ever gathered together in any large numbers. And large crowds of colonists of whatever class, they were hardly ever seen anywhere except occasionally at church, like for a wedding or a major holiday, or sometimes at the courthouse. And the landless freedmen were probably never the majority, even at these large gatherings. Now, the one possible exception was in time of war. So if the colony was ever really threatened with invasion, then all the able-bodied men would have to be called together in its defense. And in this case, a lot of these poor freedmen might find themselves gathered together in large units with guns. And if that happened, then imagine, would you want to be the wealthy gentleman appointed to command such a unit? Would you sleep easy in your tent at night, knowing you were surrounded by largely discontented, unattached young men with guns who very likely hated your guts? And for the colonial government, they had to wonder, could the loyalty of such a militia be trusted? And could it be counted upon not to transform suddenly into a marauding mob of bandits or worse? Now, it happens in the year 1673, during a time of war with the Dutch. Governor Berkeley wrote that the landless men were so desperate that if a foreign power attacked the colony, they might make an alliance with the foreigners and turn against the crown. And he wrote, quote, "A large part of the people are so desperately poor that they may reasonably be expected upon any small advantage of the enemy to revolt to them, in hopes of bettering their condition by sharing the plunder of the colony with them." End quote. So he sees their loyalty as hanging by a thin reed, if that. And in the following year, in 1674, the governor reportedly learned of and foiled two so-called mutinies that had been plotted among the poor men in two parts of the colony. And it's not clear who took part in these supposed conspiracies or what their aims were. But it is clear that by the mid-1670s, the leaders of the colony saw it as a tinderbox. And the governor was right that foreign conflict would be the spark that would ignite a conflagration, but not in the way that he had expected. It was not the Dutch or the French or the Spanish. Rather, what was the light that would set this kindling on fire and touch off a massive violent revolt? Well, it was not any direct clash over the price of tobacco or prevailing wages, nor over control of land, nor the right to vote, but rather it was a dispute over the borderlands and conflict with the Indians. Now, why would it be that? Well, from the perspective of the freedmen, they had been led to expect access to land when they became free. And a basic problem from their vantage point was that arable land within Tidewater, Virginia, was running out. And when colonists ventured too far out into the outer borderlands, say up to the Potomac or west to the Fall Line, they were liable to be raided or expelled by indigenous peoples, defending what they considered to be their territory. So the colony was starting to reach the limits of expansion, beyond which they could not obtain more land without antagonizing or waging war against the surrounding Indian tribes. And the governor and his council did not want this to happen. They did not want to see a war destabilizing and draining the resources of the colony. So a tension developed specifically over the Indian question, you could say. So the governor and the landowning elite wanted to maintain peace with the Native Americans and keep them as trading partners. That was profitable to trade for things like hides. Whereas the new freedmen wanted to confront neighboring tribes in order to protect the new settlements from raids and attacks, and to seize territories, expand the colony, and open access to more land. And acquisitions of territory would tend to benefit the freedmen while they would work against the interests of the big landowners. So if freedmen could not access land of their own, then they had to become tenants or servants of the major planters or to work for them for low wages. And this would more or less serve to recreate the social arrangements of the English countryside, which is great if you're in the elite. But it was a nightmare for many of the freedmen, since this was exactly the kind of situation that they had hoped to escape in emigrating to the colony. So Indian policy, and specifically the question of whether or not to escalate border wars, became the most direct point of contention between the social classes. And the governor's and the royal administration's reluctance to wage war against Indian tribes could be seen as a sign not only of weakness but of corruption and disloyalty, as the elite-run government was perceived as favoring their own selfish interests as against those of the colony as a whole. So resentment mounted in the 1670s against both Native Americans and the royal administration, both of which were seen as unfairly blocking the freedmen and the impoverished yeomen from obtaining more land. This tension finally came to a head in the mid-1670s and erupted into a large rebellion and civil war, which we call Bacon's Rebellion. So the actual initial trigger of Bacon's Rebellion was a petty conflict in the northern borderland of the colony. So in the early summer of 1675, a sort of petty trade dispute broke out in Stafford County, which was then the northernmost county in the colony on a bend in the Potomac River. And the dispute was specifically between a planter named Thomas Matthew, who had a plantation on the Potomac, and a group of Indians of the Doeg tribe. So this is an Algonquian tribe that had not been part of the Powhatan Confederacy. And by this time, they were mostly settled north of the Potomac in what the English considered to be the colony of Maryland. And the Doeg Indians had a grievance against Matthews in that they accused him of not paying for some goods that they had traded to him. And so one night, a band of Doeg crossed the river and raided Matthews' property, taking some hogs as a sort of forced repayment of this debt. Now, Matthews raised the alarm, and he and some neighbors assembled into a militia. They pursued the party and engaged them in a skirmish. And in this skirmish, one of Matthews' herdsmen was killed. But nonetheless, they did not relent. And a company led by Matthews ventured across the river in pursuit of these Indians, and they came to a nearby Doeg village. And there they attacked a cabin and killed 10 occupants. Now, at this point, perhaps this conflict might have ended for a time without causing a crisis for the colony of Virginia. Perhaps the Doegs would have simply withdrawn northward or westward to get out of the line of fire, and this conflict might have died down. Except for the fact that the militia continued their rampage, and another unit, led by other officers, attacked another cottage in the Doeg village, and here they killed 14 occupants. And this, you could say, was a point of no return, since the Indians killed in this second cabin were not Doegs. Rather, they were Susquehannocks. And this was very significant. So the Susquehannocks were a different, unrelated tribe that had no history of diplomatic contact or conflict with Virginia. They were just caught in the line of fire. The Susquehannocks were a tribe of Iroquoian speakers who for centuries had lived in modern-day Pennsylvania, but in the 1600s they had migrated southward into the upper Chesapeake area in order to get away from their traditional powerful enemies in the Iroquois Confederacy, most of all the Seneca, and also in order to take advantage of trade with the European colonies, including New Netherlands, New Sweden, and eventually Maryland. And they became heavily involved in the fur trade, so by the mid-1600s they were fairly prosperous and very well armed. In 1660 they made a formal alliance with the colony of Maryland, so that both parties could mutually defend against their shared enemies from the Iroquois Confederacy. In the early 1670s, the Susquehannocks abandoned their principal town, which had been up on the Susquehanna River, and they built a new one on Piscataway Creek near the Potomac in what is today Prince George's County, Maryland. Now, when fighting broke out in 1675 between the Doegs and this Virginia militia from Stafford, there happened to be a trading party of Susquehannocks temporarily lodged in a cabin in the Doegs village. And these were then, as we saw, drawn into the line of fire. And when the English massacred this group, the Susquehannock tribe naturally reacted. In the late summer of 1675, the Susquehannocks began a campaign of retaliatory raids along the western frontiers of Virginia and Maryland. And Governor Barclay appointed 2 commissioners named Allerton and Washington to go and investigate the situation. And these officers immediately went beyond their instructions. They gathered up militias from northern Virginia and Maryland. They sought out the Susquehannock fighting parties and found them in a fortress on the Potomac. They then called out their 5 leaders to a parley to negotiate. They then immediately took these 5 leaders captive and killed them, and they laid siege to the fort. And the siege went on for some weeks until in the later fall, the Susquehannocks managed to sneak out of the fort and slip past the besiegers. So in the winter of 1675 to 76, the Susquehannocks fled from the Potomac Valley. They moved westward into the Piedmont region, and they set up new encampments. From there, they launched retaliatory raids upon the inland flank of Virginia. In January 1676, one attack in the upper Rappahannock Valley killed 36 colonists. After this point, it seems the Susquehannocks were satisfied that they had gotten their revenge, and they withdrew westward and calm returned for a time. But these attacks by the Susquehannocks showed how vulnerable and poorly defended the Virginia frontier was. So in February, several other Indian tribes took inspiration and began attacking these Virginia outposts at will. And this led to a kind of unpredictable reign of terror. And as the conflict fell into a sort of chaos, the Virginians had to decide how to respond. So the governor dispatched the lieutenant governor with a force of 300 men to the frontier. But then he suddenly changed his mind and countermanded the order. And he said that he would instead put this matter before the council. Now, the next meeting of the governor's council was not until late March. And at that point, the governor and council decided upon a defensive strategy. They adopted a plan to build a series of 8 fortresses to defend the western frontier from the Susquehannocks or other Indians, and they levied a new tax to pay for these forts. The forts would be garrisoned with 500 militiamen, and they also would enlist allied and friendly Indians to help in the defense. And finally, they decreed that no planter or militiaman may attack any Indians without the governor's express instructions. So for the first few weeks, as this plan went into implementation, no militiamen were killed, and Barclay soon declared this defensive strategy to be a success. But many colonists were not at all satisfied, and in fact were infuriated by each and every aspect of the governor's policy. So for one thing, they condemned the governor's enlistment of allied Indians, whom they saw as suspect and likely secret enemies of the colony. And the fortresses they saw as an expensive boondoggle that could not actually protect the frontier against a mobile adversary that struck quickly without warning. And indeed, the plantations and outposts continued to be raided and burned, and several more colonists were killed or taken captive. And perhaps most of all, the colonists, including the smallholders and the freedmen, they were incensed by the restriction against engaging their Indian opponents without permission. So this hampered them from retaliating against raids and from doing what many of them really wanted to do most of all anyway, which was to expel the native tribes to the west, seize their lands, and expand their settlements into the Piedmont. So colonists repeatedly circulated and presented petitions to the governor asking for more protection and for a more aggressive policy, and they were continually refused if they were heard at all. And to top it all off, many colonists accused the governor of restricting their actions and refusing their petitions out of desire to protect the fur trade, in which Barclay himself was directly invested. And so they saw him as disloyal for the sake of personal profit. Now, by the springtime, disaffection and anger among the colonists, especially the land-hungry freedmen, was reaching a boiling point. And in April, the situation spiraled out of control. A rumor spread around the upper James River Valley that a large Indian raiding party was encamped nearby and was bound to attack soon. So scouts began to circulate around the county, beating the drum and summoning the militia to gather. A large number of colonists mobilized of their own accord and amassed into a large volunteer militia of over 1,000 men, and they encamped in a large plantation field in the area of Jordan's Point on the south bank of the James River near to Henrico. And they were ready to act, but it was unclear what their strategy would be, and they had no one to lead. Who was in command? So they sent a delegation to Jamestown to ask the governor to appoint an officer to command them, but the governor refused even to hear them. And at this point, most of the elite of big planters and colonial officials were disturbed and dismayed by this swelling militia with no commander, and they just hoped for calm to somehow return. But there were also some who were sympathetic. So this includes some minor elite figures like smaller planters, judges, justices of the peace, who had been affected by the raids along the western frontier, or who had been shut out of the upper circles of power in Jamestown and resented the governor. And these began to coalesce into a broad sort of anti-Barclay party. And possibly the wealthiest and most well-connected of this emerging anti-Barclay coalition was Nathaniel Bacon. So who was Nathaniel Bacon? He is an extremely controversial and mysterious character in colonial history, and he casts an enormous shadow, especially over colonial Virginia. Yet no portrait, no journals, no personal papers from him survive. And this is partly due to the destruction that followed in the wake of his brief life in Virginia. So going by Bacon's background, he should have been expected to be another crony official benefiting from the self-dealing oligarchic system around the governor. So he was born in 1647 to a gentry family in Suffolk in England. He married a wealthy lady, attended university, and took the grand tour in Europe. He was an overspender, and he failed in several attempts to make his fortune. So in 1674, at the age of 27, he migrated to Virginia. And presumably he wanted to obtain land or offices and so, support his extravagant lifestyle. And once there, naturally, he would get help and guidance from a relative that was an elder cousin in the colony of the same name, Nathaniel Bacon, and possibly also from Governor Berkeley himself, who was related by marriage. And in the later months of that same year, in 1674, he obtained 2 tracts of land, one on the upper James River near Henrico, and another farther up by the falls. And he also was then appointed to the governor's council, which is a remarkably fast rise to power. So you can see here a kind of patron-client relationship where the governor is somehow socially connected to him, and the governor is now over 70 years old, and he's extending, favors and patronage to his young 27, 28-year-old kinsman. And yet Bacon did not generally attend council sessions, and he did not insinuate himself into the inner circles of power, nor further cultivate a relationship with Berkeley. Instead, it seems he spent most of his time at his plantations on the upper James, and he surrounded himself with minor figures who distrusted the governor, such as neighboring planters from Henrico County and minor judges and customs officials. And some of these individuals resented the governor due to disputes over land or money, or were suspicious that he was engaged in financial misconduct. But the most widely shared grievance among this circle was that they desired a more aggressive anti-Indian policy. So naturally, they sympathized with the smallholders and landless men who in the spring of 1676 gathered into a militia in defiance of the governor. And it seems Nathaniel Bacon himself was further radicalized when in April, an Indian raid on his plantation called Bacon's Quarter killed his overseer. So not long after, Bacon met together with several of his planter friends, and they traveled together to visit this militia encampment at Jordan's Point. There, Bacon distributed some liquor to the men, and the men acclaimed him as their leader. So in the later spring, everything escalated very fast. For one thing, the governor found out about Bacon accepting this command of the volunteers, and he sent out a message warning Bacon not to march forth and summoned him to come to Jamestown. But Bacon ignored the summons, and instead he traveled around the western counties gathering more men. The governor, for his part, gathered up his own armed force from around Jamestown and sent it to apprehend Bacon. But it was already too late. By the time this group reached Henrico, Bacon had already taken his militia and marched west beyond the fall line. So arguably, this could be seen as the first act of rebellion, and it only escalated further from here. On May 10th, the governor declared Bacon to be a traitor and expelled him from his seat on the council. He then dissolved the assembly and called for new elections for the first time in 14 years. So he perceived that this might be the only possible release valve to lessen this tension that had led to this great act of mutiny. And the governor promised that this new elected assembly would address the public's grievances. And ironically, Henrico County elected Nathaniel Bacon as one of their burgesses. But meanwhile, Bacon was off fighting against Indians. He and his militia marched southwestward, and they reached a tribe called the Occaneechi. They commandeered the Occaneechi to attack a nearby encampment of Susquehannocks, and then they turned against the Occaneechi and killed many of them as well. In June 1676, Bacon learned from allies in Jamestown that he had been elected to this office in the new assembly, and they advised him that his best move was to return to the capital, make peace with the governor, and ask for clemency. But first he went back to his plantation, and he boarded his sloop and sailed down the river and anchored in the river off Jamestown. He was very cautious, and he sent a messenger ashore to approach the governor and ask for Bacon to speak with him. The governor then ordered the fortress guns of Jamestown to fire on Bacon's ship. So Bacon's boat withdrew back up the James, but at night Bacon snuck back into the town and met with his allies in Jamestown. At daybreak, he was trying to leave and get back to his boat, but he was detected. So he had to flee onto his boat and sail off upriver, trying to get away, but he was pursued and overtaken by a merchant ship acting under the governor's command. He was then arrested and taken back to Jamestown as a prisoner and handed over to the governor. So naturally, there was great amazement and anxiety of what would happen now. But what ended up happening was the governor pardoned Bacon and gave him back his seat on the council. So Berkeley probably saw Bacon's popularity, and he knew that there was great public anger fueling his actions. And so he figured that it was better to try to mollify and buy off Bacon and hope for the movement behind him to then die down. But Bacon, you could say, would not take yes for an answer. And a few days later, he told the governor that his wife was sick, and he asked for leave to leave Jamestown and go back up to Henrico. And at the same time in June, this new assembly met. And this assembly has been described as fractious and rebellious. It represented many marginal local elites that were frustrated at being so long locked out of power and voiceless. And the assembly was divided over how to respond to the breakdown of authority. And they passed a raft of new laws, which tried to resolve the situation in different ways. So you could say on the pro-Bacon side, the assembly enacted an aggressive Indian policy, and it pardoned all rebellious acts that had taken place in the colony since the previous year, basically giving a blanket clemency to Bacon and his militia. But also they banned any unlawful so-called assemblies, routs, riots, and tumults. In governance, they enacted a series of reforms to try to break up the planter oligarchy and mollify the discontented freedmen. For example, they restored the right to vote to the landless men. They banned the holding of offices by newcomers to the colony, and this would prevent appointments of sort of wealthy cronies and relatives coming in from England. And ironically, it would have blocked Bacon from getting his council seat, but, no matter. They also added counselors and state ministers to the tax rolls, where most of them previously had been exempt from taxes, and they lengthened the periods of time in which debtors could pay back their debts. And finally, in the matter of local county governance, they banned multiple office holding, limited sheriffs to only one term in office, and they banned counselors from the governor's council from taking part in local county court proceedings. So finally, on June 23rd, the assembly was preparing to wrap up their legislative session and go home, when Nathaniel Bacon showed up again outside Jamestown, this time at the head of a force of 500 men. They marched into the town and took possession of the key strategic points. They then surrounded the State House, where the governor, council, and assembly were inside. The governor sent out a messenger to ask what Bacon wanted, and Bacon replied with a series of demands. He wanted formal commissions for himself and 30 subordinate officers to fight the Indians, a law allowing the removal of government officials from office, a blanket pardon for all of his supporters, a letter from the governor to King Charles II justifying Bacon's actions, and restitution for the seizure of his sloop. The governor was infuriated, and it seems he ran out of his hiding spot in the storehouse, and according to witnesses, he faced the militia, opened up his shirt, baring his chest, and dared them to shoot. He then looked around and found Bacon, and addressed him directly. He called Bacon a rebel and a traitor, and he put his hand on his sword and shouted to him, "Let us try and end the difference singly between ourselves." So you can imagine how indelible this dramatic scene was, seeing this, 70-something-year-old governor confronting his own 28-year-old kinsman and challenging him to a duel to settle this insurrection. And Bacon refused. He said he had no desire, quote, to hurt a hair on your honor's head. But he insisted on his demands and shouted, quote, "God damn my blood, I came for a commission, and a commission I shall have before I go." So clearly at this point, he is a rebel, but he still wants to see himself as acting within proper channels. And it is the legitimacy of that royal commission that only the governor can give him. So Bacon turns and tells his men to make ready, and they cock their muskets and take aim at the State House. At this point, the leaders of the assembly, who have been watching this whole time, rush out, and the burgesses immediately agree to comply with all of Bacon's demands. The councilors then go to the governor and plead with him to agree to these demands as well, and he reluctantly acquiesces. 2 days later, on June 25th, in their last action, the assembly enacts all of Bacon's demands into law, including granting him a formal commission. The next day, on June 26th, Bacon left and went back to the Falls of the James, and there he dispatches his militia to go out and find more Indians to fight. The governor leaves Jamestown and holes up in his plantation at Green Spring, north of the capital. But soon after, the planters in Gloucester County, further to the north in the Middle Neck, north of the York River, these planters complain that Bacon's army is forcing them to give them men and supplies, and this is leaving them further exposed to Indian attacks from the north. Right? Bacon is siphoning off resources to go fight who knows who back into the west, but they're now vulnerable from the north. And if they point out, quite reasonably, that Bacon's army is unlawful. This was not a real commission. It had been extorted from the assembly at gunpoint. And they ask the governor to suppress these rebels. So Governor Berkeley at this point is really shamed into action. And in early July, Berkeley nullifies Bacon's commission, saying it was illegitimate, it was extorted by force. And he gathers a small armed force of his own, rides up into Gloucester County to gather his own militia to protect against the Indians. Yet once there in the Middle Neck, nobody rallies to him. The smallholders in that region all say that they are afraid that if they mobilize, they'll be dispatched to fight against Bacon, not the Indians, and they have no interest in fighting a civil war against Bacon. So the governor now sees that he has really lost the loyalty and obedience of the bulk of the population of the colony. So at this point he flees, not just to his plantation, but all the way across the bay to Accomac on the eastern shore. So now Nathaniel Bacon moves into the power vacuum. On July 29th, he marches into Middle Plantation, which is a sort of quasi-fortified area of plantations on the Virginia Neck, just above Jamestown. And there he issues a so-called Declaration of the People condemning Berkeley and a manifesto arguing for an aggressive Indian policy. And there he pressures the large planters around this sort of traditional core of the colony in the Virginia Neck. He pressures the large planters to fall in line and support him until Charles II can be informed and persuaded to intervene on their side. And he further dispatches a small fleet of boats to cross the bay and to try to seek out and capture the governor. So with his power now reasonably consolidated in the core of the colony, Bacon then sets out again to attack more Indian tribes. And in particular, he targets the Pamunkey, that traditional sort of core dominant tribe of the Powhatan Confederacy. And he follows the Pamunkey into a large, dense swampland in the Middle Neck called the Dragon Swamp. And there the pursuit drags on for weeks, with Bacon's army trying to seek out the encampments of the Pamunkey as they dwindle and grow exhausted. Meanwhile, Berkeley, back on the eastern shore, he defeats the sea expedition sent to seek him and attack him, and he gains control of the fleet, and hence of the bay and the rivers. And in early September, he sails back to the west across the bay and up the James, and he approaches Jamestown in his flagship. And the town is held by a force of 800 men, loyal to Bacon. But the governor offers them a pardon if they will not resist his return to the State House. And they accept the offer, and Berkeley retakes control of the town. But this restored regime does not last very long. In September, Bacon finally defeats the Pamunkey, and he emerges from the Dragon Swamp. He learns that the governor has nullified his commission and retaken possession of Jamestown. So Bacon leads his army, or what's left of it, down into the Virginia Neck and approaches Jamestown by land. He encamps at the ruins of the old glassworks, and he decides that he is not able to take the town by direct assault. So on September 13th, they lay siege to Jamestown. And Berkeley's troops are unwilling to fight against the rebels or to suffer through a long siege. So they begin to simply abandon and withdraw from the town by boat, most of them probably, going back to their farms. So on September 19th, the governor as well sneaks out of the town and sails back across the bay to Accomac. So Bacon sees that the town is now basically abandoned and undefended. And he realizes that he cannot simply retake possession of it again, because fighting will simply continue and it will keep being traded back and forth as long as the conflict goes on. So instead, Bacon gives his men orders to destroy the town, and they torch it and burn it to the ground. But after this destruction of Jamestown, what is Bacon's situation now? He has lost a lot of his popularity among the colonists after torching Jamestown, and he's also lost a lot of his men to fighting and disease. So in order to replenish his numbers, he begins recruiting indentured servants to his army, promising them freedom and nullification of their indentures if they will join him. And this does gain him some more men and some support among the real ultimate underclass of the colony, which is the servants. But it has also the effect of further turning the big planters against him. Bacon also needs more supplies, so the armed rebels begin raiding plantations on the Middle Neck, and this escalates as more and more servants and freedmen begin to vent their anger and resentments against the elite by plundering and burning the big gentry estates, including among them Barclay's own plantation at Green Spring. For several weeks, Bacon then dithers. He cannot resolve who is the real main enemy, Barclay to the east or the Indians to the west? And what is his ultimate goal? Is it to justify himself to the king, or perhaps to create a completely independent commonwealth under his own command, like Cromwell had done 25 years earlier back in England? And we cannot know whether Bacon was on this sort of ultimate path towards total radicalization and even revolution, since in the middle of this crisis, on October 26th, Bacon died of the so-called bloody flux, probably dysentery. After Bacon's death, two of his lieutenants took over command of his army and of the small outposts that they had taken possession of, mainly around the Middle Neck. But his army was much weakened, and Governor Barclay from the Eastern Shore learned about Bacon's death, and he enlisted the help of 6 armed merchant ships that had just arrived from England. And they began to patrol the rivers, firing upon rebel outposts, overwhelming them with firepower, and obtaining their surrenders one by one. By the end of January 1677, Barclay was firmly back in power and in control of most of the colony. So the broad political effects of this rebellion were, for one thing, the tributary Indians in the Tidewater were devastated, and many other tribes were driven far to the west. The landless freedmen and servants had been defeated, and their dreams of dislodging the ruling class were crushed. But the rebellion nonetheless was also a shot across the bow to the gentry elite, and these now saw that they had to be more attentive to popular grievances if they wanted to keep order and control over the colony. Now, as for Governor Barclay and his closest allies in the ruling elite, in the winter of 1677, the governor launched, you could say, a kind of revenge tour, and he held a series of courts-martial that quickly tried and hanged all of Bacon's surviving officers and henchmen. The assembly was called together to pass an act to provide for recompense to the loyal supporters of the governor, and the government used this act then as a justification to plunder and often destroy the former rebels' farms and properties, and to track down, try, and execute more and more of them every week. And this really dragged on all through the winter. So while Barclay was still overseeing this punitive campaign of plundering and executions, in early February, a large fleet arrived from England. So at this point, you could say the other shoe dropped. So what had been going on in England? Well, the court at Whitehall had learned about the rebellion in dribs and drabs over the course of 1676, and they had mixed feelings about it. Many at court already disliked and distrusted Barclay. They resented his insistence on maintaining autonomy in the colony. And they saw in this rebellion a possible opportunity to reform the colonial regime and bring it under tighter control from Whitehall. So in late fall 1676, the government dispatched a fleet with 1,000 armed men and 3 commissioners. And these commissioners had orders to remove Berkeley from office and summon him back to England, to nullify all of the so-called Bacon's laws that had been passed the previous year, to issue a blanket pardon to all of the rebels other than the main ringleaders, and to open a commission of inquiry to investigate the causes of the revolt. And by the time they arrived in late winter 1677, the rebellion was already over. But the armed force remained in the colony nonetheless. And the commissioners, with this, armed force backing them, the commissioners commanded the planters to feed and supply the army. They opened their commission of inquiry and heard grievances from the colonists, and they prepared a report which found that the colonial regime had governed in too heavy-handed a manner, had used excessive tactics in crushing the rebellion, and ought to be reformed to take away some of its autonomy and to put it under closer royal control. Meanwhile, Berkeley remained stubbornly in office and refused to hand over command to the lead commissioner, Herbert Jeffreys, until finally in May, afraid that Jeffreys was going to have him arrested and imprisoned, Berkeley finally yielded and boarded a ship back to England. So over the next year and a half, Jeffreys tried to reorganize the colony, and he was constantly resisted by the gentry elite, whom he derided as, quote, a few ignorant planters. He often kicked his opponents off of the council or out of the House of Burgesses. But the elite planters, for their part, they desperately tried to maintain their position at the top of Virginia society. They saw now that there was a real threat of rebellion from below, and that the crown was pressuring them to give up some of their power from above. So over the summer of 1677, the elite divided into factions over the question of what sort of changes and reforms they should be willing to accept in order to maintain some semblance of the status quo and in order to remain atop Virginia society. So there were 3 basic factions that took shape. There were the hardliners, or so-called Green Spring faction. So these were elite planters who had been closest to Berkeley. And these refused to give up any powers or prerogatives, and they tried to oppose and frustrate the commissioners at every turn until hopefully they would give up and go home. Then there were the so-called trimmers. So these were planters and officials who were more willing to give up significant powers, to give up on colonial autonomy. These generally were not personally linked to Berkeley. Then thirdly, there were the moderates in between. And these actually were led by Nathaniel Bacon the Elder, that surviving cousin of the rebel leader. So the moderates accepted that the relations between crown and colony did have to change, but they wanted to protect the powers of the assembly and the courts as much as possible. And they wanted to, you could say, quietly impede the commissioners' reforms while stopping short of open confrontation. And this group ended up having the most support among the assembly and the office holders after 1677. But these factions basically took shape pretty quickly in the aftermath of the rebellion, and they then remained quiescent under the surface of politics for several years. In the fall of 1677, the head commissioner, Herbert Jeffreys, died. And for a time, the lieutenant governor stepped in and filled in for about 2.5 years until the new governor could come in to take up the office. And through these years, there was a sort of brief partial respite in the political turmoil, right? The lieutenant governor didn't really have a mandate to act aggressively to reform the colony. So there was a broad recovery and readjustment in the aftermath of the rebellion. The assembly met for a time at Middle Plantation, that fortified enclosed area north of Jamestown, while the capital at Jamestown started to be rebuilt, and migration into the colony resumed, although the number of European indentured servants diminished. Finally, in the winter of 1680, the new royally appointed governor arrived, and this was Thomas Lord Culpeper. So he was a longtime loyalist of Charles II, who had even gone into exile with Charles during the interregnum. And with the Restoration, he had become a kind of honored elder statesman of England. And he was appointed as governor for life, and he sailed to Virginia in the winter of 1680. And he arrived in the colony with a set of instructions to pass a series of bills to help the colony to grow, including by encouraging the building of new towns and by making it easier for foreigners to naturalize in the colony. But he also was instructed to enact reforms curtailing the powers of the assembly. So now the assembly could not meet without being convoked by the governor. They could not initiate legislation. Bills could only be drafted by the governor and then presented to the assembly for approval. And petitions from the commoners could only go to the governor and council, not the assembly. So these reforms basically would reduce the assembly to just a rubber stamp for the governor. And after taking office, Culpeper for a time operated skillfully. He was able to get important bills like the town bill passed through the assembly easily, but he shelved the more dramatic constitutional reforms until later. He then took a break and sailed back to England for a while, and he left the colony again in charge of the Lieutenant Governor Chicheley, and he instructed Chicheley not to convene the assembly while he was away back in England. But in the meantime, in early 1682, tobacco prices dropped dramatically, leading to a temporary depression. And the planters, especially the hardliners, who were led by the secretary of the colony, Robert Beverley, the hardliners insisted on convoking the assembly to deal with this crisis, and most likely they hoped to enact a law capping tobacco production in order to try to restore prices. And petitions came into the lieutenant governor from all over the colony. So the lieutenant governor gave in and called the assembly together. But just then, as they were ready to start their session, he got a message from Culpeper in England, again forbidding the assembly from meeting while he was away. So Chichester gave in again and sent the Burgesses home. And this further inflamed the planters beyond just the so-called hardliners. So in the summer of 1682, a new rebellion broke out. And this time gangs of smallholders assembled and went around several counties, destroying tobacco plants in the fields. So this was like a, tobacco growing moratorium by force. And the lieutenant governor declared this uprising to be a riot, which is serious but short of rebellion, which is treason. And he had some of the suspected leaders of the campaign arrested, but he pardoned the rest of the saboteurs if they would stop this sabotage and go home. Now, Culpeper was ordered to return to Virginia when the Crown found out about this crisis. And he dragged his feet. He just wanted to hang out in England. But he finally did sail back to Virginia in the fall and arrived in December. And he declared the plant cutting campaign to be treason, and he hanged 2 of the planters who he accused of leading this insurrection. He then altered a whole bunch of legislation by decree, and in the spring of 1683, he then declared everything to be resolved, and he sailed back again to England. Upon arriving in England, King Charles then promptly fired him, and he was replaced as governor, this time by Francis Lord Howard. So Lord Howard was a Protestant nobleman from a prestigious but poor noble family, and he was close with the king's brother, James the Duke of York, who pulled some strings and got him appointed as governor of Virginia after Culpeper was fired. And Lord Howard at first got along reasonably well with the Virginia gentry and even with the hardliners. They gave him a chance initially. Then in the spring of 1684, another power struggle began, as the governor proposed a series of bills and reforms, including a poll tax and a reform of the courts that revoked their existing autonomy and their ability to make their own bylaws. So the assembly was deeply dismayed and refused to enact any of these reforms. So in June, the governor simply enacted them by decree. And the colonists could do nothing about this for the next year and a half, as the assembly was not in session. And during this time, the King Charles II back in England died, and he was succeeded by his brother, James the Duke of York, who became King James II. And James was a Catholic, and this accession to the throne raised alarm among his Protestant subjects and touched off a large mutiny, for one thing, in England called Monmouth's Rebellion. And after this point, the distrust between the governor and the Virginia planters in Virginia was further inflamed, and the feuding and petty power struggle in the colony became subsumed into a wider struggle over the fundamental constitutional arrangements and balance of power in England. So you could see these struggles over these decrees that the royal governor was trying to enact against the wishes of the assembly as a kind of echo and extension of the mounting political war in England. And we'll get into that more later when I think in a future lecture I'll discuss the effects on the colonies of the brief, tumultuous reign of James II and the spillover of the Glorious Revolution into America. But finally, if we step back from these power struggles, we can see more broadly that Bacon's rebellion set Virginia onto a new path, especially demographically. So after the rebellion, the main source of new laborers in the colony shifted significantly away from indentured European workers and toward African slaves. So why would this happen? Well, there were two main reasons, one simply economic and one political. So economically, in the 1680s, there was a partial economic recovery. So in 1680 to 81, the price of tobacco increased for the first time in almost 20 years. It then dropped again in 1682, and it never recovered to the point where it had been back in the Civil War and interregnum period, during the height of the tobacco boom. And more than that, production skyrocketed. So by the end of the 1600s, Virginia's tobacco production reached about 47 million pounds a year, fourfold what it had been in the 1660s. And revenue had increased about sixfold. And this was partly due to growing markets abroad, especially in the European continent outside Britain, for instance in France, Sweden, and Russia. So many smokers found Chesapeake tobacco to be of better quality than other varieties. And Virginia tobacco also provided a good commodity for English merchants to trade for forest goods. So by about 1690, 100 ships regularly bought tobacco in Virginia to take it to England for processing and then re-export to the Baltic and other parts of Europe. The question then was, how could the planters make profit off of this expanding trade if the price was still significantly lower than it had been back in the mid-1600s? And the answer was that they had to keep production costs low in order to still eke out a profit. And the main cost still was labor. So in order to compete in these new conditions, planters cut costs by investing in African slaves, slaves whom they did not have to pay and whom they could exploit for as long as they were productive and then just toss aside once they were a burden. So with the growing English slave trade after 1680, several slaving voyages began landing in Virginia every year. It became another serious, consistent destination for English slave traders alongside the Caribbean. And this then became a major source of labor for the big planters who could afford to invest the purchase price up front. The second reason for this turn towards African labor was political. So Bacon's rebellion had demonstrated the political dangers of the indenture system. When employers brought in thousands of indentured laborers, they recruited them not only with the offer of paying their passage. Who cares that you're crossing the ocean unless there's something further that you're going to acquire after you're there in the colony? So they were recruited not only with the payment of their passage, but also with a series of promises. Some explicit, like the offer of clothing, grain, and livestock when they became free, and others implicit. Namely, they promised on behalf of the colonial regime that they would become free with the opportunity to obtain land and all the social status and political rights that came with being a freeholder. And this then created a big liability for the colony, and if they could not deliver on these implicit promises, there would be hell to pay. The whole social system would be thrown into chaos and mutiny. So the supply of African slaves offered a way around this danger. It was a supply of laborers who arrived in the colony with no legal or political rights, implicit or explicit. And the historian Edmund Morgan famously argues that slavery and then racism offered a way to square the circle. In other words, a way to maintain order and social hierarchy while at the same time promising legal and political freedoms to the common man. So this, contradiction could be reconciled so long as there was another third category of people marked out by color and social status who were excluded from those freedoms. The freedmen can enjoy land, the vote, freedom of movement, etc., as long as the hard labor on the plantations was performed by people who had no freedom and little to no prospect of ever becoming free. So African people supplied the laboring group that made land and liberty for everyone else possible. And racism then supplied the convenient justification for this radical exclusion of Africans, or so-called Negroes, from liberty. So this is basically the famous argument in American Slavery, American Freedom, which Morgan said he began writing as a way to account for this paradox that so many of the most eloquent defenders of liberty, like Jefferson, were at the same time slaveholders. Right? So it's an apparent paradox, but in Morgan's argument, they are two sides of the same coin. And Morgan argues that the key to unlocking this paradox lies in the so-called ordeal of colonial Virginia in the 1600s. Now, it is unclear, I would say, how much the Virginia planters and merchants were consciously trying to solve the political dilemma that had led to Bacon's rebellion, as opposed to simply following the financial incentives that made slave importation profitable. But either way, it is the case that they began importing fewer and fewer indentured servants in both absolute and relative terms, such that by the 1690s, the number of slaves being brought into the colony overtook the number of European workers, and the massive English migration into Virginia was coming to an end. So hopefully later we will pick up the story of Virginia and how this transformation continued into the 18th century. But in the meantime, we'll be talking about the other very early colonies, probably French Canada and Newfoundland being next. So thank you so much for listening, and thank you to my patrons. And as I said, this lecture is brought to you by the Great Lakes Midwest of the United States, by which I mean the Midwestern states east of the Mississippi, which were part of the old Northwest Territory, as distinct from the states west of the Mississippi, which were in the Louisiana Purchase. And lastly, I would like to thank my current active patrons in the Great Lakes Midwest, including in Illinois, Dan, Diane, Mike Gallagher, Jordan Goss, and Ponyhound, in Indiana, Ross Gerke, in Michigan, Tammy DeWale, and in Ohio, Kevin from Akron and Sonata She Wrote. Thank you.